Before we start, please make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video with your friends and family. Also, can you please tell me from where and what time you're watching? Thanks.
The air inside the basement morgue was cool, almost too cold, yet the walls seemed to radiate a strange kind of oppressive heat that only I could feel. It was the middle of the night, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, their flickering barely noticeable anymore after so many late shifts. I was alone, as I usually preferred to be when working. Grandpa had always warned me about this work. "Always ask permission," he would say, his voice grave and low, a rare departure from his usual good humor. Back then, I thought he was joking, just an old man spinning superstitions into my otherwise scientific world. Grandpa had spent his life as a mortician, and while his craft was precise, his tales were often anything but logical. Now, years later, I stood in his shoes, but not his beliefs. The third body of the night was laid out in front of me, a man in his 40s with no visible injuries but an expression frozen in absolute terror. His wide-open eyes seemed to track me as I moved around the room. I told myself it was just the angle, a trick of the light, but something deep in my gut felt off. I hadn't seen death quite like this before. I glanced at the clock. Almost 3 a.m., the witching hour. I gave myself a dry laugh, shaking off the chill creeping up my spine. I prepped the tools, a scalpel, forceps, all neatly arranged on the steel tray. My grandfather's voice nagged at the back of my mind. "Always ask permission." I rolled my eyes, muttering under my breath, "Okay, fine, permission granted. Happy?" The words echoed faintly in the quiet room, swallowed by the hum of the lights and the faint metallic clinks of my tools. I made the first incision down the chest, my hand steady despite the strange unease that lingered. As I worked, something strange caught my attention. A smell, faint but distinct, wafted up from the body. It wasn't the usual stench of decay. This was sharp, metallic, with an undertone of something musky, ancient. It reminded me of old, damp earth, the kind that clung to forgotten relics buried too long. I leaned closer, frowning. That was when I heard it, a faint rustling noise behind me. My head snapped around, but the room was empty, as it should have been. My shift partner, Luca, had left for coffee almost an hour ago and hadn't returned. I stared at the door for a moment longer, the sound still faintly ringing in my ears, before turning back to the task. The heart came out next, its weight unnervingly heavy in my gloved hands. My breath caught as a shiver rippled through my body, a feeling like someone had brushed ice against the back of my neck. The air grew thicker, heavier, pressing down on my chest as though the room itself was alive and watching me. A movement flashed in my peripheral vision and I froze. It was a shadow, quick and fleeting, disappearing into the far corner of the room. My pulse quickened. Logic told me it was my mind playing tricks, a trick of the fluorescence. But I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Forcing my focus back on the autopsy, I worked quickly, but my hands trembled slightly as I prepared to examine the cranial cavity. As I made the cut, something impossible happened. A faint swirling vapor emerged from the skull, curling upward like ghostly smoke. I stumbled back, my scalpel clattering to the floor. The mist lingered for a moment, coalescing into shapes that seemed to move, faces forming and dissolving before my eyes. I blinked hard and it was gone. The morgue was silent once more. A chill swept over me, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, soft and unintelligible at first, barely more than a breath of wind. It grew louder, clearer, until one word emerged: "Leave." I staggered back, my heart pounding. The voice had come from the body. His lips, still as they were, had seemed to form that single word. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, to walk out and not look back, but I couldn't move. The lights began to flicker. Shadows on the walls elongated and twisted, stretching into grotesque, impossible shapes. They writhed like living things, inching closer with every flicker of light. My hands shook uncontrollably as I reached for the tray, scattering the instruments in my panic. I tried to turn toward the door, but something held me in place. It wasn't physical. There was no grip on my arms or legs. It was something deeper, something primal. And then I saw his eyes. They were open now, glowing faintly in the dim light. Not the dull stare of death, but something alive, intelligent and ancient. They bore into me, filled with unspeakable truths and endless malice. My chest tightened as the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of voices speaking in a language I couldn't comprehend. Shadows began to coalesce behind me. I couldn't see them, but I felt them, massive and oppressive, leaning over me. The air turned frigid, my breath visible in short, shallow gasps. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The lights steadied, the shadows retreated, and the whispers ceased. My legs buckled, and I collapsed against the counter, gasping for air. The door flew open, and Lucas stood there, his face pale with concern. "What the hell happened to you?" I couldn't speak. The words wouldn't come, trapped beneath the weight of the memory. He helped me to my feet, his questions unanswered, and led me out of the morgue. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that I left something behind in that room, or that something followed me out. Grandpa's words echo in my mind every time I step into work. Always ask permission. As a forensic pathologist, death became my constant companion. It was as familiar to me as my own breath, a shadow that lingered in every corner of my life. I'd seen it all: charred bodies, mangled forms, and those who simply slipped away. My work required a cold, clinical detachment, a necessary shield against the horrors I encountered daily. But all that changed one night, when I broke the one rule I'd always dismissed as superstition: never touch the sweat of the dead. Those words, given to me by Dr. Hayes, my mentor and the man who trained me during my residency, were not something I thought much of. He was a stern, gruff man who had spent decades surrounded by death, and his voice always grew soft and almost reverent when he spoke of this rule. The dead have their own secrets, he'd say, and some things are better left untouched. I used to think it was just the rambling of a man who'd spent too many years alone in the morgue. But that night, I learned how wrong I was. It was late, the last body to arrive after a long and grueling shift. A middle-aged man found in a back alley, his cause of death listed as unknown. There were no external wounds, no signs of foul play, nothing to explain what had happened. Yet his face was locked in an expression of pure terror, his mouth frozen in a silent scream, his eyes wide open and bloodshot. The thing that caught my attention the most, though, was the sheen of sweat that still clung to his body. Even though he'd been dead for hours, it was thick, dark, and sticky, almost like tar. It shouldn't have been there. In a cold morgue, the moisture should have evaporated, leaving behind only a corpse. But it was still there, glistening unnaturally in the harsh light. Against my better judgment, I leaned closer, my curiosity piqued by something that defied logic. I should have worn gloves, followed protocol, but something about that sweat, it seemed to draw me in. I touched it. The moment my fingers made contact, a sharp, freezing sensation jolted through me. It wasn't just cold, it felt like my hand had plunged into ice, like the kind of chill that creeps into your bones and lingers. I recoiled, but not before noticing the pale, numb tips of my fingers. It was as though the skin had turned to stone. And yet the sensation didn't fade. It spread deep into my arm, making the pain throb like a dull ache, as if my entire body was freezing from the inside out. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some rare chemical substance, something the body had secreted in response to stress or some unknown condition. But as I inspected the body further, I couldn't shake the feeling that something much darker was at play. Then the lights flickered. A cold breeze swept through the room, and I felt the air thicken, like something was pressing against me. A voice in my mind screamed to stop. But I couldn't tear myself away from the body, from the sweat. The next day, the consequences of that fateful touch began to manifest. The numbness in my hand spread up my arm, like vines creeping under my skin. Dark veins formed, twisting and curling beneath my pale flesh, creating an almost unnatural pattern. I couldn't feel the affected areas, just a cold void where my senses should have been. Panic set in as I realized something was horribly wrong. I dug through the records trying to find any clue that would explain what was happening to me. That's when I found a note hidden beneath all the official reports. It simply read, "Avoid direct contact with bodily fluids. Possible contamination. No further details." It wasn't much, but it was enough to send chills down my spine. What had I touched? What had I allowed to get inside me? Days passed and my condition worsened. My skin took on a sickly pallor, almost translucent, and the veins kept spreading like they had a mind of their own. At night I began hearing whispers, low, unintelligible voices that seemed to come from the very walls of my apartment. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, not mine, but the same sticky dark substance that had coated the man's body. It clung to me like a second skin, suffocating, drowning me in cold dread. When I stumbled into the bathroom and looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. My face was gaunt, hollow. The black veins pulsed beneath my skin like they were alive. I knew then that I wasn't just sick, I was being consumed. In a desperate attempt to find a solution, I sought out Dr. Hayes. Though he had retired years ago, he still lived quietly in a small house outside the city. When I showed him my arm, his face drained of color. "You touched it," he whispered. "You touched the sweat." His voice trembled as he explained that some bodies, those who had died in violent or unexplained ways, carried a residue of their final emotions, fear, anger, terror. It wasn't just biological sweat. It was something much darker, something that clung to the living, seeking to pull them into the same fate as the dead. It wasn't just inside me anymore. It was becoming me. Dr. Hayes told me of an ancient purification ritual, one that might work, but came with great danger. It involved fire, salt, and sacred prayers meant to sever the connection between the living and the dead. With his help, I prepared the ritual, my only hope that it would stop the corruption within me. As I recited the incantations, the black veins on my skin writhed. They seemed to pull at me, like something was trying to escape, something that had once been human. The air thickened with the stench of decay, and the whispers turned into screams, piercing my mind. Shadows danced along the walls, closing in around me. Then, in an instant, the darkness erupted from my body. A plume of smoke burst forth, coiling and twisting in the air before vanishing. The room fell into a suffocating silence. The ritual had worked. Partially. The veins receded. The coldness left my bones, but something of that darkness remained. I was no longer the same. My reflection in the mirror felt wrong, like I was looking at someone else. I returned to work, but the morgue no longer felt like a place of science. Each body I examined seemed to carry a piece of that same darkness, a shadow that watched me. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was waiting for me to make another mistake. And now, every time I step into the cold, sterile halls of death, I hear Dr. Hayes's voice echoing in my mind, a reminder of the rule I had once thought was foolish. Never touch the sweat of the dead. I never imagined that a night like this would come to pass. I've spent more than 2 decades as a forensic pathologist, working through every imaginable death, suicides, homicides, accidents, anything that could happen to a body. I've dissected the remains of people torn apart by violence, found answers in the most grotesque scenes. But nothing prepared me for the experience that unfolded that night. It began like any other shift, I was assigned to the body of a young woman discovered in the murky waters of a canal. She had been missing for weeks, and by the time they pulled her out, her body was waterlogged and bloated, her skin an unnatural pale. But what struck me the most wasn't her appearance. It was the way her face seemed locked in a quiet stare, eyes closed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me. The morgue was empty except for me. My colleague had called in sick, leaving me to face the night alone. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights was the only sound, and the faint clink of my tools felt like a reminder of just how alone I was. I should have felt at ease, but something gnawed at me. It was an odd sensation, the awareness of someone or something else in the room. At first it was subtle. A faint noise, like the swish of fabric across the floor, distracted me. I froze, trying to focus on the sound, but it was gone before I could make sense of it. My rational mind tried to dismiss it. Just the old pipes settling, maybe, or a trick of the mind. But a part of me knew better. Then, just after 3 a.m., things took a turn. I glanced up from the body, wiping my hands when I saw it. Through the frosted glass of the morgue's entrance, a shadow flickered, long, distorted, and unmistakably human in shape. My heart skipped, and without thinking, I gripped the scalpel tighter. The shadow lingered for a moment, its form twisting as if considering the space. Then it moved, slowly, and disappeared into thin air. I stood frozen, my pulse roaring in my ears. I told myself it was nothing, that I had imagined it. But as I turned back to the body, the air felt different. Thick, heavy. My breath came out in visible puffs, and the temperature plummeted. It was then that I saw it. The woman's chest. Her heart. Her still lifeless heart. Twitching. It was subtle, but it moved. I leaned in, my mind searching for any logical explanation. Muscle spasms. Decomposition. But no, this was different. It was like her heart was trying to beat, fighting to push blood through a body long gone. I jumped back when the lights flickered, violent, almost erratic. The tray of instruments I'd been using crashed to the floor with a deafening clang. I spun, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the body, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were open. Her once closed eyelids now exposed glassy, lifeless orbs staring directly at me. I froze. My breath caught in my throat, trying to rationalize the impossible. Had I imagined it? Was this just some trick of the light, or had her eyes truly opened? Then to my horror I saw it. Her lips moved. Not a sound, just the movement of her mouth, forming a word that sent ice through my veins. Help. My heart pounded in my chest, and panic surged through me. I grabbed my suturing tools, my hands shaking, desperate to finish my work and escape. I couldn't leave her unfinished, not after what had happened. But as I worked, the air grew heavier, pressing down on me like some invisible weight. The shadows in the room, those ever-present creeping shadows, seemed to move on their own, swirling just out of the corner of my vision. Then came the noise, a loud crash behind me. I spun around, expecting to see something, but there was nothing. The morgue drawers were rattling violently as though something inside was trying to get out. The hairs on my neck stood on end, but my feet felt rooted to the floor. And then, silence. Complete silence. I glanced around, trying to make sense of it. That's when I saw her again. Not the body on the table, but her shadow, standing motionless in the corner, her head tilted, as though watching me. A wave of nausea hit me, and I bolted from the room. I left everything behind. The tools, my notes, my dignity. I ran until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cool night air, the fear still heavy in my chest. The next day, when I tried to tell my colleagues what happened, they brushed me off, claiming it was all stress-induced. Hallucinations, they said. But I knew what I had seen. She wasn't gone. That night changed something in me. I couldn't work alone in that morgue anymore, but the memories didn't stay there. At night, in the silence of my apartment, I would feel her presence again. A cold, almost tangible breath on the back of my neck. A whisper, faint but unmistakable, brushing against my ear. I don't know what she wanted, or if I would ever truly escape her, but I fear one thing above all else, that she'll return. And next time, she might not be so quiet. My name is Jason. I'm 27, and I work as a forensic assistant in a local morgue. People usually think that working with the dead must be morbid, but it's just part of the job. Until one night, I encountered something that shattered everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. It started on a particularly stormy evening. The winds howled like wolves outside, rattling the windows of the morgue. Inside, the place felt colder than usual, the dim lights flickering with every gust of wind. I was alone that night. My colleague had to leave unexpectedly due to a family emergency. The storm had made the roads dangerous, so I agreed to stay behind and finish the work. The quiet was unsettling, made even worse by the storm's relentless pounding on the roof. The morgue, with its cold steel drawers and sterile smell, always felt eerie, but tonight it seemed different. As I moved between the rows of bodies, making sure everything was in order for the morning shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like the air had thickened, pressing in on me. I tried to ignore it, blaming the storm, but every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every noise seemed louder than usual. Around 2 a.m., when the storm was at its peak, I heard something. It was a faint sound, soft, like a whisper. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining to hear over the thundering storm, but the sound vanished as quickly as it appeared. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was just the building settling. Maybe it was my tired brain playing tricks on me. I brushed it off, trying to focus on finishing my tasks. I had just completed the final autopsy for the night and was about to clean up when it happened. The temperature in the room suddenly dropped, and I felt a chill crawl down my spine. As I turned to head toward the exit, I froze. A body, one I was certain had been in its compartment moments earlier, was no longer lying still. It was upright. The man in his early 40s was pale, his skin stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were wide, glassy, and vacant. His limbs moved with unnatural jerks, stiff and uncoordinated, as if his body was rebelling against the rigor mortis that had set in. He stumbled forward, his feet dragging across the cold floor, coming closer to me. My body refused to move. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. My mind screamed that this was impossible, that it wasn't happening. Was it a prank? Had someone slipped in to play a cruel joke on me? But no, the way he moved, unnatural, jerky, made my skin crawl. The corpse stopped right in front of me, collapsing with a heavy thud. I stood there, unable to comprehend what I had just seen. My legs felt like they were made of stone as I slowly approached, desperately hoping that when I touched the body, it would be just another macabre trick. But as I knelt down, his head shifted. His glassy eyes met mine, and his lips trembled. I watched, horrified, as they parted slightly, forming the words "help" without making a sound. My heart pounded in my chest. Panic flooded me, and I backed away, my mind racing. I couldn't think. I had to get out, but before I could react further, a deafening crash of thunder shook the building, and the lights flickered. When they returned, the room was plunged into darkness. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The storm outside roared, but inside there was only silence, thick and suffocating. I held my breath, listening, waiting, but I heard nothing. Then, for a split second, the room lit up again, and I saw it. The body was gone. The space where it had been was empty. The compartment door stood slightly ajar, swinging as if someone or something had just left. I didn't think, I just ran. My legs carried me out of that morgue faster than I thought possible. I burst through the door into the rain-soaked night, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about the storm. I just had to get away from that place. The next day, I returned, expecting everything to be back to normal. But the morgue felt wrong. My colleagues carried on with their usual routines, unaware of what had happened the night before. The bodies were where they should be, peacefully resting in their compartments. I began to wonder if I had imagined everything. Was I so tired that my mind had tricked me? But then, just a week later, the storm returned. And with it, the same oppressive feeling from that night. The walls of the morgue seemed to close in on me as I worked in the same preparation room, sorting through files. And then I heard it again. That groan, low and mournful, like the sound of someone in deep sorrow. It was coming from compartment 23. My heart raced as I approached. The door was shut, but the sound, the groaning, continued. I reached for the handle, every instinct screaming at me to turn and leave, but my hand wouldn't stop. I opened the door, and there he was, the man. But now his eyes were wide open, staring directly at me. His mouth was open, stretched into a silent scream that sent chills straight to my core. Before I could react, the room was lit by a sudden flash of lightning, and I saw it. A shadow. Not just any shadow, but a figure, humanoid in shape, standing beside the body. It absorbed the light around it, its edges distorting and wavering like smoke. The cold from that night returned, wrapping itself around me, sapping my strength. I slammed the compartment shut and ran, not stopping until I was outside, soaking wet and shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't explain what I had seen, but I knew that I couldn't work there anymore. I handed in my resignation the next morning. That was the last time I set foot in the morgue, but even now I can still hear that mournful groan in the silence. And every storm, I remember the figure, the man, his pleading eyes, the shadow. And I know that the morgue holds secrets that should never be uncovered. I was just unfortunate enough to see one of them, and I'll never forget it.